continuing with our study of the book of Romans. Today we're going to be in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 14. You can find this on page 804 of your Pew Bibles, or you can follow along on the screen. So let's listen to God's word together, beginning in verse 8. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. The commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. And do this, understanding the present time. The hour has come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of the sinful nature. Please pray with me. God, we thank you for the words of your servant Paul, and we thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to gather and to hear those words. And God, we thank you that you've given us hearts and minds that can reflect on and receive these words, that they might be more than just characters on a page, but Lord, they might be inscribed on our hearts, they might be inscribed in our lives, and they might shape us. And so God, we pray that as we spend some time reflecting and thinking together about these instructions and encouragements from your servant Paul, that you would give us eyes to see you and ears to hear you. It's in your Son's name we pray these things. Amen. In the second chapter of 1 Peter, we read the following words: But you are a chosen people, a holy priesthood, a royal nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Those are some powerful words. Those are some vivid images to apply to the church. But I'm kind of partial, even though we usually use the NIV, I'm kind of partial to the version of that passage that generations of Christians grew up hearing and reading from the King James Bible. In the King James, that passage from 1 Peter says, But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And apart from all the ye's and hats, what makes the King James Version noteworthy, I think, is that phrase, a peculiar people. We are a peculiar people, Peter says. We are called to be different. We're called to embody life in a way that seems unique and distinctive and maybe even odd to the culture around us. And this peculiar mode of life is going to manifest itself in a few different ways. On the one hand, we've been chosen to live in a manner that points to all the positive qualities of God that can change the world. And so part of being a peculiar people means that we are to love more deeply. We are to seek peace more passionately. We are to show mercy more fervently than those around us, so that the grace and the goodness of God will be evident in our every word, our every action, and our every thought. At the same time, this peculiarity, this distinctiveness, will come out in the ways that we view and understand what is wrong with the world, or simply that we believe anything is wrong with the world at all. One of the oddest things about Christians, at least in the eyes of the world around us, is that we still hold to the idea of sin. We still hold to the notion that this world is broken, that the people in this world hurt one another, and that nations and systems are unjust, and that the root of all these problems, and this is what makes us really peculiar, is our rebellion against God. In the early 70s, there was a famous psychiatrist named Carl Menninger, and he surveyed the landscape around him. He reflected the ways that his patients lived their lives and the way they talked about their lives. And he wrote a book entitled Whatever Became of Sin. It's a question that we're still asking to an extent. Because if there's any area in which Christian doctrine collides forcefully with the perspectives and practices of the culture in which we live, it's this one. We believe in calling sin, sin. We believe in naming the evil that is in our hearts. And finally, we believe in rooting out and repenting of those things that keep us away from God. no matter how fun they might be, or how exciting they might be, or how good for business they might be. And this isn't anything new. We might think that we're living in a world that has just discovered sin. We might think we're living in a world that has opened up a multi-lane highway to hell and just merged onto it at full speed. But even if we do seem to always be developing new ideas about how to sin and new ways of indulging our broken desires, that doesn't mean that sin is new or that our call to be different in the midst of it is anything new. Back in the first century, the early church stood up in the face of sin in all kinds of ways. They stood up against the infanticide that was pervasive in the Roman Empire. They spoke out against the neglect of the poor that was a feature of their society. Later, the loudest voices crying out against the brutality of the gladiatorial battles in the Colosseum was the voice of the church. And then, as today, when Christians spoke out against sin, when they named the consequences of sin in their culture, they were met with resistance. They were met with disbelieving looks, ridicule, and persecution. Then, as now, when Christians talked about sin, people around them wondered what the big deal was. Then, as now, their neighbors wished they could just let it go, live and let live. But then, as now, it was important to the followers of Jesus that they acknowledged the destructive capacities of human sinfulness, and that they helped the world around them see just how big a deal these things actually were. And so in writing to the church at Rome, Paul was writing to a group of Christians who were living in the heart of the civilized world, but they were also living in the belly of the beast. They were beneficiaries of all that Roman culture had to offer in terms of amenities and entertainments and military security. But they were also faced daily with tough questions about how to live as people of faith in a society that was so at odds with nearly everything they believed. And so Paul wanted to encourage this church at Rome to follow Christ. He wanted to help them remain strong in the face of opposition. He wanted them to reject sin. He wanted them to embrace righteousness in all the ways that God had called them to do so. And so we find in the 13th chapter, as Paul's letter nears its end, we find some powerful statements about the nature of sin, but also about the alternative that God holds out. Paul uses three images here, three metaphors that would have been familiar to his early readers and that are familiar to us. Three pictures that can demonstrate to us why sin is more than just an abstract concept, why it's actually a pretty big deal. So let's look briefly over the next few minutes at what Paul has to say about sin. Let's look briefly about what he has to say about why sin matters in both the first century and also in the 21st century. Well, the first thing that Paul says about sin in this passage, the first reason why sin is a big deal, is because when we sin, we are not fulfilling an obligation. Paul uses the language of debt here. He says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another." Debt was a familiar concept to people in the first century. Sometimes the accumulation of debt could lead to imprisonment or even enslavement in the ancient world. When a debt would become insurmountable, people were forced to sell themselves and maybe family members as property in order to meet their obligations. Well, debt is no less familiar to us, I'm sad to say. In a world where credit card companies and predatory lenders seek out those who are vulnerable, people can find themselves swallowed up in debt before they even know what hit them. Just a few bad decisions, a few desperate moves can lead to a lifetime of pain. The concept of sin as a debt is something that has a long tradition within Christianity. We sometimes pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," talking about sin in this way. In the Middle Ages, the theologian Anselm envisioned sin as us failing to pay God a debt of honor. But in this passage, Paul seems to be talking about something else. When we sin, when we cheat another person, or when we lie to another person, or when we hurt another person, or when we violate the bonds of relationship and community and trust that make us human and that God created us for, we are failing to pay the debt, the only debt that really matters, the debt of love. Even that phrase, the debt of love, might give us pause. It's tricky for us to envision love in terms of debt, right? We tend to think of love as a gift, and that's certainly true. But love also creates the space, and it even creates the expectation for an appropriate response. One biblical scholar, Jimmy Dunn, notes that Paul seems to have in mind here the fact that we have been loved, we have been accepted by Christ, and therefore the appropriate, and we might even say the expected thing to do is to respond in kind. Not only to God, but also to those around us. We know that we can never fully repay God for the love that he has shown us. This isn't that kind of debt. It's not the kind of debt that we can ever fully repay. And we also know that God will not penalize us for our spiritual poverty, but instead, if we come to him, he'll fill us up with what we need. But we also know that from those who have been given much, much is expected, and we have been given much love. Therefore, God rightfully expects that instead of sinning against one another, instead of acting towards one another in unloving ways, we would fulfill our obligation. We would live lives of kindness and mercy and truth in the midst of our neighbors. So our salvation is a kind of debt that we repay, not by writing a check or not by ticking off a series of items off a list of rituals, not by doing something grandiose and impressive. No, we fulfill this debt simply by loving as we have been loved. There are lots of obstacles to that, but the biggest one is our sin. Sin contradicts this in every way. Sin renders us unfaithful, even when it comes to our most basic obligations. Well, the second image that Paul uses here for sin and its effects on our life is the image of the night. In Paul's illustration here, this image of night plays a kind of dual role. On the one hand, he says nighttime is a time for slumber. This is kind of the good part about night, in a way, right? But God has brought new life and a new creation, a new reality into this world, Paul is saying. And so the time for slumber is over. He calls us to wake up to the new thing that he's doing, the new thing that God is accomplishing. But sin, the resistance to this new life, the desire to hold on to what we're comfortable with, the clinging to old ways, keeps us in this state of slumber. How many of you are heavy sleepers? How difficult is it before that first morning cup of coffee to stumble through your routine, to even accomplish the most basic of tasks, especially when you're roused from a deep slumber immediately and unexpectedly? Sometimes we don't even know where we are when the alarm goes off. We're disoriented. Maybe we're a little bit grumpy. Maybe we're completely useless. How many of you are tasked with trying to wake up heavy sleepers? This might be more familiar to some of us. How hard is it to get a sleepy child out of bed and ready for school? How hard is it to nudge your sleepy spouse after the alarm has gone off and they need to get up for work? Well, that's what Paul is trying to do here in his words to the Roman church. He's saying, wake up. It's time. God is calling you to so much more than your sleepy, sinful, lazy ways of looking at the world could ever allow. God wants you to grab hold of what he's doing. But sin can make us disoriented. The distance that we put between ourselves and God as we pursue our own desires can make us grumpy and even useless when it comes to God's purposes in our lives. Sin can make us forget where we are. It can make us forget what we've been called to. No one wants to sleepwalk through life. No one wants to go through life in a haze. Well, God doesn't want us to sleepwalk through life either. And so he rouses us from our slumber. He calls us out of our sin. But for Paul, sleep isn't the only thing that happens at night. Nighttime is also when we do shameful things, he says. Nighttime is when we get into trouble because we think that at nighttime we're safely hidden from those who would disapprove. There's an old saying, maybe some of your parents have said it to you, maybe you said it. Nothing good happens after midnight. It's something parents tell their kids, it's something coaches tell their players, so that they'll realize, they'll know that if they're out past a certain time, even if they're not looking for trouble, trouble will have a way of finding them. The nighttime, Paul says, is a time for things like debauchery and sexual immorality, things like dissension and jealousy, things like orgies and drunkenness. Paul is calling the church out of this darkness. Live in a different way, he's saying. One of the things that Paul knew about the world he lived in, one of the things that I think he would say about our world too, is that it's a world where there's a lot of darkness. This doesn't mean that the world is itself evil or wicked. It doesn't mean that the world God created isn't good. It means that we as human beings have become very good at seeking out those dark places. We become very good at creating those dark contexts where we can imagine and pretend and try to convince ourselves that the sins we're embracing really aren't sins at all. They're just personal decisions. They're just different choices. Maybe they're not for everyone, but they're okay for me. This is how I've chosen to live my life. But these are the kinds of rationalizations that we can only make in the darkness, because light tends to expose them for what they truly are: empty justifications and self-delusions and destructive fictions. In John's Gospel, Jesus tells Nicodemus, "Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what he has done has been done through God." Get out of the darkness, Paul says. Come into the light. Step into God's goodness and leave behind those things that only bring shame. Sin is a big deal because in our lives, it's an attempt to keep the sun from rising. When we embrace sin, we live in an enduring nighttime where slumber and shame prevent us from being who we're created to be and embracing the light that God created us to embrace. And that brings us to the third metaphor, the third image that Paul engages here in his treatment of sin. It's the image of clothing. Now, first, this might seem like an odd metaphor. Clothing, we might think, is just an external reality, not something that has to do with our heart, not something that has to do with our spirit. But as my kids have gone back to school over the past few weeks, and as we've engaged in the morning ritual, and thankfully my kids aren't real high maintenance about this, but the ritual of saying, what do you want to wear today, and helping them get their clothes together in the morning, I've been reminded of my own days as a student, and especially my days in junior high, when getting dressed for school wasn't just about shielding my body from the elements. It was about making a statement, right? There's a point in our lives when how we dress is about sending a message. I believe that the shirt I was wearing, or the jeans I was wearing, and especially the tennis shoes I was wearing as I walked through the hallways of my school, would in some mysterious way confer a certain kind of identity upon me. That I would either be judged and found wanting by my classmates, or that they would see that I was someone to reckon with in the 7th grade hierarchy of coolness. And it's easy, with a little distance between me and my younger self, to laugh at that, but it's also a fact of life that at various points, as we struggle with questions of identity, we take comfort in the uniforms that we put on, the clothes we wear that make a statement about who we are. Well, in Paul's day, clothing had an even more pronounced effect. The cut, the style, the color and fabric of your garment would set you apart as a member of the ruling class or a slave. One could distinguish someone's social status and maybe even their profession. You could tell the difference between a married woman and a woman of less noble reputation simply by looking at the apparel they wore. So clothing in the first century, in the Roman world, as in our time, had a way of conferring identity. One of the reasons that sin is so powerful, one of the reasons that sin is so destructive, is that it can have a way of shaping our identity. What starts off as an indulgence can become an addiction, and then it becomes a lifestyle. We can wear our sin like a status symbol that advertises to the world who we are. Questions of behavior and identity can become so tightly bound up with one another that it becomes difficult to know how to redefine ourselves. In the church, we might come up with formulations like hate the sin and love the sinner, but when what we do is so connected to who we are, these kinds of aspirations are tough to follow through on or to make sense of. Paul gets this. Paul knows that we are what we wear, and he calls for a complete wardrobe change. Put off the deeds of darkness, Paul says, and put on the armor of light. Then he takes it a step further and he says, clothe yourselves with Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of your sinful nature. See, Paul knows that our outward behavior is never just outward behavior. It's deeply rooted in who we are. It can deeply impact who we are. Paul had seen it in his own life, in the judgmental and self-righteous nature that he wore proudly as he wore his Pharisees' robes. And he knew that if he were going to be whole, he was going to have to shed these things. This isn't always easy. Anyone who's ever cleaned out a closet or a chest of drawers for a yard sale knows that it's tough to part with that favorite t-shirt, threadbare one that you've had since high school. Sometimes there are things that we simply need to shed. Sometimes there are simply debts that we have to fulfill. Sometimes we need to wake up from our slumber. We need to come into the light, and we need to begin living life as God intended. Please pray. God, we thank you that in a world that seems to think that sinfulness is kind of an old-fashioned idea, and the narrative of sin and forgiveness is a quaint tale, you've called us to be different. You've called us to acknowledge that sin is real, and that sin can have destructive consequences in our lives. But Lord, thankfully, you're a God who doesn't make sin the end of the story. Because, Lord, you realize that the only thing that can save us from our sin is divine forgiveness, your forgiveness. And so, God, you extend your hand of mercy to us when we are in our sin. You call us to step into the light. You call us to shed the clothing, the deeds of darkness that we're wearing. You call us to allow you to fulfill the debt through your power and your grace, the debt of love that is so often found unpaid in our lives. And so, God, as we seek to be your people, your children, we pray that your power and grace would be at work in us so that we can put off sin and begin living the life that you've called us to. It's in your Son's name we pray these things.